For some, Machiavelli was an immoral teacher of evil, while for others, he separated politics from morality and constructed a new science of statecraft. He's been described as a patriotic republican, but also as an advisor to tyrants. We now have over 500 years of interpretation of his political thought. In this video, we're going to explore some of the trickier questions about how to interpret his writings. If you want more of an introduction to Machiavelli or an analysis of his main text, then check out my other videos. And don't forget to subscribe for more political philosophy. The Prince and the Discourses. The biggest question when it comes to Machiavelli is the relationship between his two central works, The Prince and the Discourses. They seem to teach two very different lessons about politics. A central question is, are they part of a single unified project, or are there tensions and contradictions between these two texts? I don't think there's one easy answer to this, so I'm going to run through a few different possibilities. One solution is to privilege one text over the other. Interpreters of Machiavelli, such as Spinoza and Rousseau, thought that Machiavelli was a committed republican who couldn't have been serious when he wrote The Prince. These authors thought that The Prince must be a satire, and that Machiavelli was actually just showing us what tyrants could do in order that we would be able to better resist them. But I want you to read The Prince and tell me if it reads like a satire. Why is my advice so similar between the two texts? And why do I engage in such a patriotic and passionate language at the end of the book? A second alternative is to say that these two texts represent his views on two separate subject matter. The first, The Prince, is addressed to rulers on how to govern a state as an individual, while the Discourses is about how republics can grow and prosper. There's some truth to this, because in The Prince I say I'll only address principalities and I'll treat republics in another text. But in the Discourses, I talk about both types of regimes. And I also use lots of examples of republics in The Prince. For instance, I tell rulers to take the Roman Republic as their example for matters of military action or foreign policy. So the distinction between principalities in The Prince and republics in the Discourses is not so clear. A third alternative, which also involves privileging the Discourses over The Prince, is to say that the Discourses represents the whole of Machiavelli's political thought, while The Prince represents only a partial view. Leo Strauss calls this the dominant modern interpretation of Machiavelli. On this view, The Prince addresses a very narrow question of how princes as individuals can govern a territory, while the Discourses addresses a much broader subject matter and includes Machiavelli's preferences for republics over principalities. For modern Republican interpreters, Machiavelli's most genuine views are expressed in the Discourses, while we might argue that The Prince was written for a very specific goal of gaining employment with the Medici family. We therefore might need to take advice that he offers in this book with a grain of salt, or at the very least read it alongside what he has to say in the Discourses on Livy. But I never say that the Discourses should be taken more seriously than The Prince. It might be longer and cover more topics, but even some of the things I have to say in the Discourses sound like advice that one might give to a tyrant. My advice on military expansion or pacifying foreign states is not the typical kind of thing that a democratic republican would advocate. If we want to try and find compatibility between the two texts, we could go a step further and suggest that perhaps the two texts are two steps in the single process of forming a republican government. Both texts express a desire for a strong and unified state. Perhaps The Prince, then, is written for a country in chaos that needs a single leader to unify the country, while the Discourses express more of an ideal form of politics based on Machiavelli's reading of ancient Rome. In a book called Pride and Solace, Norman Jacobson argues that Machiavelli writes The Prince in order to incite Lorenzo Medici to unite Italy with the promise of glory and honour. But The Prince is ultimately a trap. Jacobson suggests that once the job is done and Italy is united, the Republican forces would overthrow the ruler and institute a well-ordered Republican regime. If Jacobson's right, then there is a certain consistency between the two texts, because The Prince represents not necessarily the best form of politics, but what was necessary to create the conditions for a Republican government. But there's a lot about what I advise new princes that would destroy rather than cultivate the conditions for Republican politics. I tell new princes that they should make their subjects fearful and obedient rather than cultivate their civic virtue. I also advise new princes that anyone who opposes them, and this includes Republican forces, that they should be immediately disposed of. There isn't much I say really in The Prince about investing in a community, in cultivating virtue, or in building any kind of collective project. I'll give you one more attempt to reconcile these differences between Machiavelli's two texts by a more recent writer, Christopher Holman. In his interpretation, the Prince and the Discourses represent two moments in a single, unified normative project that emphasizes human beings' creativity and innovation. For Holman, the true subject of the Prince is not necessarily an individual ruler, but indeed anybody. The narrative of the book emphasizes how any individual can fully actualize themselves as an innovative and creative person. On this view, The Prince is a treatise on what it means for an individual to be a creative human subject, whereas the Discourses discusses how a regime would be institutionalized that would allow for a democratic collective to institute this creative power over society as a whole. How would you interpret these two texts? Are there contradictions between them, or are they part of a single worldview? Machiavelli's historical methodology. A second important issue is Machiavelli's methodology that he employs in his writings. Most of interpreters agree that he pioneered a new method for understanding human society, but they disagree on what this means precisely for political science, history, and philosophy. It was common for humanist writers to seek to draw a moral lesson from their historical writings. When Machiavelli writes about history, he's often involved in a very selective appropriation of different elements in order to teach us both negative and positive lessons that he thinks are going to help us with our own present practices. I think that wise people should follow the paths already taken by great individuals. By learning to imitate the action of these great figures, we can try and recreate their success and grandeur in the present. I think we can look back in history not only to understand our past, but to better diagnose and cure the problems of the present. This is based on an idea of historical recurrence. This means that our human nature remains unchanged, but the figures and episodes in history will have a cyclical nature to them. I also think that the ancient world, and in particular the Roman Republic, offers a superior guide for human action than any modern examples. One of Machiavelli's contemporaries, Francesco Guicciardini, thought that Machiavelli's doctrine of imitation was fundamentally flawed. He disagreed with Machiavelli's tendency to see people as fundamentally wicked and for this human trait to remain unchanging across historical epochs. He emphasized the uniqueness of each moment in history. He therefore cautioned against applying universal maxims without attending to the particularities of each case. In his criticisms of Machiavelli's work, he claimed that Machiavelli was too absolute in his advice. He didn't think, for example, that Rome could be a perfect example or model to be followed. He also thought that a number of the solutions Machiavelli proposed based on ancient examples were far too remote from the realities of modern politics. Machiavelli's methodology can be difficult to decipher because he has one foot in both the ancient and modern worlds and attempts to do things using resources and tools drawn from each era. What lessons do you think we can draw from Machiavelli's use of history? Morality and religion. Perhaps the most contentious issue in Machiavelli's writings is the relationship between politics and morality. It's clear that he rejected the simplistic view that effective government is necessarily virtuous government. As a result, the mainstream view of Machiavelli was that he was a teacher of evil, that he taught us to do a number of wicked things in order to survive and be successful in politics. There's no denying that he advised many cruel practices, but it would be wrong to say that he was simply evil or that he didn't have an attempt to justify these with some kind of alternative moral code. If we accept that this is a more complicated question, then a number of alternatives open up. One view is that Machiavelli was amoral, in that he was disinterested in questions of ethics and morality, and that he attempted to construct a dispassionate science of statecraft. This view of Machiavelli as a kind of proto-political scientist, that he separated the world of morality and values from that of science and facts, was very popular in the early 20th century. A number of authors have argued that Machiavelli puts forward no moral precepts and simply gives you a technical guide for how to rule. But it's hard to see me as a forerunner to 20th century political science because I still have one foot in a world of medieval metaphysics. My writings are full of chance and unpredictable fortuna and the cyclical view of history constantly repeating itself. There are also very explicit moral lessons in my writings, which make it hard to see me as some kind of detached and neutral scientist. I often make it known what lessons can be drawn and when people acted with honor and glory. Sheldon Wallen has argued that Machiavelli's innovation was not to construct a science of politics, but rather to detach our understanding of political phenomena from any deeper basis in a systematic philosophy. Rather than follow Plato from a realm of political appearances into a deeper realm of certain truth through science and philosophy, Machiavelli chooses to stay at the surface in order to better understand and master these appearances. Another alternative that's been put forward by Quentin Skinner and members of the Cambridge School is that Machiavelli was first and foremost a classical humanist. On this view, he criticised Christianity and the role of the church and put forward an alternative based on his humanist education. It's hard to deny the importance of Machiavelli's criticisms of Christianity and the role of the church in modern politics. He criticised the teachings of the church, and in particular the doctrine that people should be meek and passive and merciful, and he thought this was debilitating for the state's ability to fight, to raise an army, and to have citizens with manly courage. Our Christian religion glorifies meek and humble men, whereas the religion of the ancients glorified strength and power. Machiavelli was a strong critic of Christianity for how it seemed to depoliticize and feminize its subjects. But it's less clear what Machiavelli actually believed about the metaphysics of religion and the possibility if we have a soul or if there's an afterlife. Was he an atheist, or was he some kind of heterodox Christian who is just critical of certain aspects of the modern church and Christianity? Leo Strauss says that it's important to note where Machiavelli is silent. In neither the Prince nor the Discourses does Machiavelli mention anything about a human soul, about a distinction between this life and an afterlife, or whether any of these political actors are ever going to obtain salvation. Does he leave these absences because he thinks they're not important questions for politics, or because he disagrees with the mainstream view? At times it seems like the only thing he cares about religion is its capacity to help people be disciplined and to allow leaders to better manipulate citizens. He rarely passes value judgments on the actual metaphysics of religious beliefs, merely on what effect they have on people. The most radical view would be that Machiavelli sought to end the role of all religions in world politics and that he wanted to establish a purely atheistic world order. Ultimately, there isn't really consensus over Machiavelli's religious views, and I think a number of interpretations are open. Most interpreters would agree that he overturned traditional Christian understandings of morality and virtue. They also think that the alternative that he attempted to construct was heavily indebted to an ancient humanist tradition. But in terms of what his positive commitments are, there's still a lot of debate over the details. What do you think Machiavelli thought the proper role was for religion in modern politics? Fortune is a woman. Machiavelli is well known for his many misogynist depictions of women in his writings. In The Prince, he compares women to property and portrays them as most suited to the private sphere of the household. His writings reinforce an idea of a war between the sexes, and he calls for traditional masculine virtues of military prowess, bravery, and courage. He also complains of how weak and effeminate modern European rulers are in comparison to rulers of the ancient world. Hannah Pitkin, in her book Fortune is a Woman, analyzes Machiavelli's politics. She uncovers how they're driven by a misogynistic fear of women and a desire to live up to a certain standard and ideal of masculinity. Machiavelli claims that the via, the Latin word for man, would have to overpower the goddess of fortune and submit her to his will. Pitkin sees in this imagery and other metaphors that Machiavelli uses throughout his writings a defensive anxiety about what it means to be a man and being sufficiently masculine in front of one's peers. Her reading in this book raises important questions both for Machiavelli, but also for other forms of republican politics that seem to rest on military virtue, glory, and masculine ideas about the separation between a public and a private realm. Jean Elshtain, in a book Public Man, Private Woman, also argues that Machiavelli reinforces this distinction between the public and private because women aren't sufficiently virtuous or violent to enact politics in the public realm. But some feminist interpreters want to reclaim Machiavelli for a feminist form of politics and think of him as perhaps a proto-feminist or at the very least some kind of defender of women. Feminists can point to some women in Machiavelli's texts who are politically effective and the way in which he calls into question certain traditional understandings of gender. Arlene Saxonhouse argues that Machiavelli actually breaks down traditional hierarchies between men and women. She thinks Machiavelli shows how effeminate men can be remade through war and through education, and that women can actually act just in the same manner as men. Feminists often draw on the example of Caterina Sforza in Machiavelli's writings, and also look to his plays and comedies and other writing aside from just the Discourses and The Prince. There is a line of feminist scholarship that argue that women can be incorporated into universal notions of civic virtue and citizenship, and that the masculine elements of Machiavelli's writings can actually be downplayed. Wendy Brown wants to draw on the resources of Machiavelli's writings for what she calls a post-masculinist politics. This would be a politics in which power isn't rejected by women as evil, but rather a project in which the resources available in Machiavelli's writing are drawn upon by feminists for a broader project of freedom, autonomy, and virtue. For more information on these debates, you can check out feminist interpretations of Niccolo Machiavelli. How radical was Machiavelli? Cambridge School interpreters like Quentin Skinner have emphasised Machiavelli's grounding in a classical humanist tradition. But to what extent could Machiavelli be seen as a radical modernist, even a forerunner to the modern democratic republican Marxist or even anarchist traditions? By highlighting the continuities between classical humanism and Machiavelli's political thought, are we not perhaps sanitizing the radical nature of some of Machiavelli's ideas? Over the past 2 decades, we've seen a number of more radical interpretations of Machiavelli, both at the level of his philosophy, but also dealing with practical political issues, such as a lack of robust control over political elites and the lack of popular participation in politics. One good example of this is John McCormack's Machiavellian Democracy, which seeks to highlight an underappreciated democratic strand in Machiavelli's writings. He wants to highlight just how suspicious Machiavelli was of elites and the kinds of institutions that he proposed in order to better control them. On his reading, Machiavelli was concerned not just with questions of political citizenship, but also with socio-economic parity. No one should be so rich that they would be able to dominate other citizens. Ordinary citizens for Machiavelli were the true guardians of liberty, and they should have special institutions in order to allow them to participate in politics and to control the negative impulses of elites. He draws particular attention to the plebeian tribunals, which allowed ordinary citizens to participate in politics and to veto certain proposals of the elite. But does this overstate the democratic and egalitarian credentials of my writings? I argue that common citizens are the best defenders of a well-ordered republic. But I also say that a republic should be founded by one person and renewed by a single leader if it becomes corrupted. I never argue for a modern democracy. I express my preferences for a republic, and in particular a mixed constitution which combines elements of different regimes. McCormack brings to light certain populist institutions that are analysed in Machiavelli's writings, but it's difficult to ignore some of Machiavelli's other remarks about the importance of political leadership and the significant role that an aristocracy would have to play in a republic. Machiavelli has a lot of good things to say about the multitude, but he also has a number of disparaging remarks about the capacity of ordinary people to govern themselves. While he will claim that a multitude is wiser and more constant than a prince, this is only after the multitude has been set within a well-ordered republic that was established and founded by a single individual leader. It's worth questioning whether, in attempting to correct a conservative reading of Machiavelli by the Cambridge School, that McCormack hasn't bent the stick a little too far in the other direction. To what extent do you think Machiavelli could be described as a Democrat? An even more ambitious reading of Machiavelli is proposed by Miguel Vatta's Between Form and Event, Machiavelli's Theory of Political Freedom. In this book, Vatta argues that Machiavelli rejected the idea that political freedom could ever be established in any kind of fixed and stable form of government. On this reading, Machiavelli thought that political freedom was essentially anarchic and had to destroy and remake political institutions for freedom to truly flourish. Vatta says that Machiavelli was the first modern theorist to understand this anarchic nature of freedom as no rule, or the absence of any form of government. Vatta seeks to prioritize the moment of rupture, or what he calls the event, over any form or any fixed governmental structure. If we adopt this view, Vatta thinks that Machiavelli is therefore the first modern thinker who truly breaks with history understood as a continual cycle. On Vatta's account, Machiavelli argues for human beings' capacity to dramatically reshape their circumstances. Political freedom for Machiavelli is the possibility of having a spontaneous and unconditioned form of politics. This reading is going to be interesting for those looking for radical reinterpretations of canonical thinkers in the tradition of political thought. But the picture he paints of Machiavelli is almost unrecognizable from most mainstream interpretations. It's going to be a bit of a stretch for those looking for a contextualized account and are interested in what the actual thinker was doing when they were writing the text. Machiavelli does seem to argue for well-ordered institutions, for a strong unified state, and for a mixed constitution. So if one were to have doubts about his democratic credentials, then his anarchistic ones might be a bridge too far. But the book offers an interesting, novel, and well-thought-out take on a classical thinker. Having seen how Machiavelli can be read as both a democrat and an anarchist, it might be interesting to see Marxist perspectives on his thought. Most prominent among these is Antonio Gramsci's reading of Machiavelli. For Gramsci, Machiavelli is a revolutionary innovator. He highlights the importance of an armed people and identifies the emergence of a new collective force in politics. He also underlines the need for new, pragmatic and realistic leaders. Gramsci argued that the real audience of Machiavelli's text is not the rulers, but indeed the common people, because the ruling authorities already receive these kinds of lessons in their education. He thought that the figure of the prince could never be a single individual, but had to be actually the emergence of a new collective subject on the stage of history. Gramsci sees Machiavelli as both a democratic philosopher, but also as the Italian Luther, referring to the Protestant reformers' attempts to initiate new ways of thinking and new forms of morality into the world. For Gramsci, the modern prince could be seen as represented by the Communist Party, whose goal it was to organise and articulate the grievances of the collective will of the workers. Class conflict has a significant role to play in creating a well-ordered republic, but I never say that class division should be overcome, or that the lower classes should somehow triumph over the nobility. I suggest that we should permanently institutionalize class conflict between the plebeian and the patrician class, and that it's this tension and balance that actually allows for liberty to flourish. There are still many differences between my worldview and that of Marx's. A continuation of Gramsci's Marxist reading of Machiavelli has been done by Louis Althusser, and a variety of post-Marxist readings of Machiavelli have been offered by figures such as Claude Lefort, Miguel Bonjour, and more recently by plebeian democrat Martin Brau. So I know there's lots I didn't cover and many more interesting questions that could be asked, but this is a starting point for thinking about a number of different interpretations of Machiavelli's work and ways in which we could read his writings. If you want to go back to basics with some of Machiavelli's text, or if you want to learn about other theorists, don't forget to check out my other videos, and please subscribe for more political philosophy.